to your flash disk or to the memory. So there is some internal memory inside the phone. So if you connect it through USB or through Bluetooth, you can see that right, just like USB flash disk. You can see, and you just copy these two files, and then you select this file. You go to the file manager of the phone and double click, or just select this file, and then it will ask you whether you want to install this application. If you say yes, it will install it, and once it is installed, it will appear in the menu or applications, wherever. It depends on phone to phone. It will come there as an application, and then you can run that application. So I would recommend, since you already you executed a J2ME, if anybody in your family, friends have a Nokia phone, which can run Java, you can transfer this file and test it out. Submit the source code. .java file. Whatever the source code you have written, that is. You immediately don't submit these. So these are compiled. So that means these are binary files. You cannot read this.
But you mentioned the compiled files on the...
Yes, so I mentioned, but for sure you have to submit the source code. If you just submit the compiled one, the executable ones, then there is no point. If you forget to submit this compiled one, but you submit the source code, we can do a compilation. This operating system, and we left at this point somewhere, last class. So Symbian OS is based, so if you look at the operating system that we have in the world, you can classify them as something which is monolithic kernel. That means everything inside the operating system, all the device drivers, all the functionalities are built inside the kernel. So the kernel becomes big and big and big, and everything outside the kernel is very small. If you look at the other point in the spectrum, on the other side, operating systems can have a kernel which is minimal, very small, which is typically called a microkernel architecture, and most of the things which are built around are outside the kernel. And so there are advantages and disadvantages on the both sides. For this platform, the other side is good, having the smallest kernel possible, and the rest of the things are outside the kernel. So if you look at Symbian OS, so this is the kernel, and inside that kernel they have further divided it into something which is called nano kernel, and we saw what is the characteristics of nano kernel. And then on top of that there are something which is just inside the kernel but outside nano kernel. And then everything between user mode applications and the kernel goes through a server. Now this is a different architecture that we never find in the computer. All the things which, so typically what happens in Linux or in Windows, whenever you go from here to here, you make a system call and you directly go inside the kernel. In our case now, the suggested thing is not to go directly to the kernel, but you make a call to the server. And then server will, if necessary, forward the call to the kernel. And that is one level of indirection. But the advantage of this is, all these applications, typically if they don't need to talk to the kernel, they can just keep talking to the server, and server will do most of the operations. Okay? And you can add more servers as you need, or you can replace the server as you want without changing anything inside the kernel. So what is inside the nano kernel? What is the most basic thing that you need? So first thing is, these are all threads, so there is multi-threading operation even within the nano kernel, and this is all in privilege mode. We talked about what a privilege mode is. The examples of these operations are scheduling. This is the first operation any operating system will do, scheduling. Without that, there is no point in having operating system. Then synchronization. Synchronization means when multiple threads are operating, they share the data. And once they share the data, you have to have synchronization, otherwise concurrently if you access the data at the same time, you can corrupt the data. Data is inconsistent. That is why synchronization, interrupt handling, everything inside that embedded system or a phone-like operating system, it's mostly handled through interrupts. Because otherwise you have to continuously wait and poll for the condition. And we'll see in the next chapter how this is done. But everything is through interrupt. At the most basic level it's hardware interrupt, and then on top of that there is software interrupts. And these you all know, mutex and semaphores. Right? So whenever there is a shared resource and multiple people want to access it, you will use these operations or primitives to make sure that you're not accessing at the same time. Most of the functions can be preempted. So last time we discussed this in detail. So what is the advantage of having preemption? And does anybody remember why this is necessary, preemption? And why we say most of the operations should be preempted?
Priorities for everything. So all the user-based processes are not allowed to, they should be preemptible as in the hardware interrupts which are more frequently used.
Right. So to extend this further, if you want your system to be highly responsive, for example, if you want your computer to be highly responsive, whenever you move your mouse or press a key, it should respond back. And it can only respond back if it is not, if the CPU is kind of idle. If the CPU is busy doing something, then it will miss this interrupt, high priority interrupt. So for the phone, it's very, so even the nano kernel, when they build it, it should be made as much as possible preemptible. So whenever something which is a high priority as an interrupt comes in, you should be able to throw away whatever you are running, and if the CPU is idle, it's well and good. But if the CPU is not idle, then you can preempt that operation, take this interrupt, service it, and then continue with your operation. So that is why most of the functions are preemptible, which is a good thing. Operations are primitive and fast, so you don't need to do a lot of computations there. So for example, you don't do dynamic memory allocation. So advantage of this is there's no need of a component that will look around for where the memory is, how much memory is empty, how much memory is full, whether there is a need of garbage collection. All of these things are not required. So that is how the nano kernel is built. And this is what you will find in most of the operating systems for small devices like PDA, phone, smartphone and everything. Another thing is, on top of this is the kernel. This builds on top of the nano kernel, the most basic part. Here also, whenever you go inside the kernel, it's all privileged operations, so we don't need to talk about this in detail. It combines the primitive operations of nano kernel. So all the things you find in nano kernel, you combine all of that and you make a little more complex task out of it. That is how the basic kernel of Symbian OS is designed. So the example of these complex tasks are object services. So here you see there is no object-oriented programming inside. But now Symbian OS, being an object-oriented operating system, they provide this functionality outside nano kernel but within the kernel. So you see object-oriented programming, threads. So for the user level thread to have, you need to have something within the kernel also that will keep account of how many threads are running, what they are sharing and so on. All of this is here. Process scheduling, that is already there and it is made more complex. Context switching, dynamic memory. So you introduce dynamic memory here. And then dynamic loading of libraries. So anybody remembers what dynamic loading of library is? Can you give me an example where you use dynamic loading of libraries?
Header files.
Header files. So what is example?
STDIO.
STDIO. And what is the advantage of having dynamic loading?
You don't have to load it every time a reference is made to that.
Right. So first advantage is, if you never use printf, scanf and all this, considering the example of stdio.h, if you don't use all of this functionality, you don't need this code. Right? That is first advantage. Second advantage is, when you write any code with using these libraries, you don't need to compile it with all of these programs. Right? So for example, there are 10 different programs using the same stdio.h. You don't need to put this code in all of these 10 programs. That is second advantage. And third advantage is, when even one program executes and uses this library, you dynamically load it, and then when the second program wants to use it, you share that space. Right? So there are multiple advantages of doing this. Disadvantages, anybody can think of a disadvantage. There is always a plus thing and a minus thing. So I talked about all the plus things. What would be the minus?
Switching time.
Switching time. No, before that. So switching time will not be an issue because there is no switching. Right? Everybody is sharing the code. So think about the first time this is getting called. What happens? Well, first program that is going to do anything which is stdio.h, scanning, what will happen? So you need to load this code, right, at runtime. The operating system has to go around, find out where this compiled code of stdio or the library is, and load it. So before you execute the first printf, there is a delay. Finding this code, loading it, and then executing it. As opposed to the other case where we just compile everything into one bundle, the code is already there when you execute it. Right? So the same thing is nano kernel. When you use the nano kernel, everything is fast. Right? But when you load a driver, for example, if you switch on your USB of the phone or Bluetooth of the phone, there is some delay. Because the operating system has to run around, find out the right device driver, libraries, load it. So there is some delay. If you switch on the Wi-Fi, there is a delay. It immediately does not get switched on. Right? There is a delay in first time, but once you use, when you load it in the memory, then it's fast. So that is advantage and this disadvantage. This is fully preemptible, which is an advantage, which is a good thing. And interrupts can cause this layer to distribute any part of the code. Right? So here you see it's most of the functions are preempted. Can you give me an example which cannot be preempted in nano kernel? And what could be one thing that we cannot preempt? An example. There are multiple things like this, but one example. So what is one operation in the basic operating system that you typically cannot preempt? Time, right? We discussed about time, clock value. So if you are updating your clock and you get an interrupt and you go away, you have lost the plus thing, right? You lose the basic, this much amount of time you should increment the value of the clock. If you miss that, your clock value is back, right? So there's some functions you cannot preempt, most of things you can preempt. Here you can preempt totally. There is nothing here that is something which is urgent. So even in the middle of context switching, whenever you are changing from one process to another process, even between that and do something else. So these are the two basic components within the operating system. Once you go out, there is everything is based on the client server model. So if you use sockets and client servers, you have done programming at least in computer networks class where you build a server and there is a client. So what is the standard mode of operation? If I tell you to write a server, what you would do? A TCP/IP server. When you
create the socket for
right.
socket, the listener, which is the listener.
Right.
Then I'll create another socket which will wait for client to connect to it.
Right. So what you typically do is a bind. Right. So standard word for this, as she was explaining, is you create a socket in the server side and you bind to that socket. So that means you are waiting for the connections now. On the client side, you will open the socket.
Send a request for connection.
Send the request. But what is it called?
ACK.
It's called connect. Okay. So here it is bind because server is continuously running and it is bound to a socket, right? And client creates the sockets and then it connects to this socket, right? And when this happens, the connection is complete, right? So there is a two-way handshake. Operations that do not require privileged operations or that have a complex implementation are pushed out to the server. Right? So there are some operations, for example, a file server, a FAT16, FAT32 file server, Wi-Fi, TCP/IP, all of these things you can push out outside the kernel. In Linux, it is all within the kernel. Now we are putting it outside the kernel because to assemble a packet and do CRC check, it's not a privileged operation. Anybody can, and it's fine for even the user program to do it. So that gets implemented as a server, and there are so many servers running within the operating system. So working with sockets, display, everything, that's outside. So this is run usually as a user mode, so it's not even privileged mode. Anybody can run this. And they require kernel-based operations only sporadically, so only sometimes. Whenever they require, for example, they assemble the packet, when they want to send the packet, they will do a system call or a kernel call. Similarly for the display, when the entire display is designed, you have the list, menu, options, everything. When you have the entire canvas designed, then only you will go to the display and ask it to print it. So that will be a privileged operation, but most of the operations will be all in the user mode. And then this is what we have already written. All your assignments you have been doing, this is all in user mode. So it's completely in the user mode, there is no privileges. It performs kernel-based operations either by interacting with the servers. So if I want to draw a diagram of this, so this is user level. It will talk to the server, and then this will talk to the kernel. Otherwise, typically this would directly talk to the kernel and this will be faster. But now in this operating system, we are going to the server and the server is going to the kernel. So there is some delay, but there are some advantages also. Or by making a system call to activate. So there is a possibility of directly connecting kernel, but there are very few times you do that. So for example, for some things, if you don't have a server, you will directly have to go to a kernel. So there is some part of the kernel that is running constantly. Anybody would think of an example in the kernel that is running constantly? Can you think of what could be in the kernel that is running constantly, never almost stops? Clock is one. Another example. What could be something that will run continuously?
Processes that will work for waiting for a call, waiting for a message, all of that will always work. Listening on the channel. Yeah, listening.
But that is interrupt based.
Yeah. But it's still gonna run constantly.
Right.
The code that is waiting for the interrupt,
Yeah, there
it
has to be.
run always.
Yeah, because if suddenly an interrupt comes and the code is not ready waiting for it, then nothing will happen.
So usually what happens is there is no code that is continuously running to receive the interrupts. The whole idea of the interrupt is you don't need to run continuously. So I will talk about this in detail later on. But one thing you can say here is, let's say if you have a round robin scheduling. What is round robin scheduling?
Every process is given some
Specific
time
time.
based on the priority and
Right.
keep cycling.
Keep cycling. So what happens is, every time the time slice is over, that code which is in the operating system and doing scheduling, context switching, it has to run. It runs, looks for the second process, executes that process, goes back. Another time slice, again it gets up and do all these things, right? So that part of the code, which if you are using round robin scheduling, is almost active. Of course, there is some time which is when it's not active, but otherwise it is continuously running periodically. So there are some pieces of code within the kernel which are running constantly, and these are called active components. So these to continuously run within, as long as your phone is switched on, it will continuously run. And there are some components which are not active always, which are all passive. So we differentiate between active and passive components. And these are set into operation by system calls and interrupts. So in fact, interrupt handlers are not continuously executed, unlike what was being said. In fact, the interrupt handlers is only executed when there is a need. It's all passive, it's not active. Those parts of the kernel that execute along with the processes. So for example, the scheduler, round robin scheduler, whichever scheduler we have, that has to continuously run. And then find out what is the next process, when the next process is selected, it has to do context switching. So all of that thing will make it an active component. Another thing is, so these are more examples, they can monitor the system in real time. For example, how much time every process is executing, how many packets, network packets were sent and received. Right? So you can get all of. So for example, in Windows, if you do a system profile, you can see how many applications are running, threads are running, CPU, memory utilization, and everything. So all of this thing where they do the, I would say, logging of all of these components, it's active in the kernel. This is another example of, so whatever component which monitors the system, that is also active. They field requests for kernel services. So whenever there is a request coming outside from the even from the kernel, outside the kernel, they will service all of those requests and load and unload system modules. So for example, the dynamic loading, that code is continuously running. Whenever there is a need, it will dynamically load something and execute it. So examples are global memory of the kernel, which is handled by all the processes and it is shared, and this is always active. Context switching and loading of modules. So for example, the device driver. So all this code is, I would say, active as opposed to other components which are inactive or passive. So what do you think? What is the best thing to do? Have everything active or have everything passive? What will be?
Everything's passive.
Right. So
This is battery saving.
right. So as much as possible, we want to minimize the active components, and as much as possible, we want to put everything into passive. So advantage of minimal active components, and this is what Symbian decided to do, is because of, for example, Symbian OS version 9 uses only 200 kilobytes of memory when it starts up. So you can see that the whole operating system runs within only 200 kilobytes on your phone in version 9. And so when this starts up, of course when it starts running and there is more demand for drivers and so on and libraries and modules, it will utilize something more. But otherwise the most basic thing starts only in 200 kilobytes. When there is a request for IR port, so a lot of phones used to have IR ports for communication, just like the remote control of your TV. Whenever there is a need, then only you load the device driver, and we'll see the whole structure of device drivers and how they are built and how the things are common between multiple. So one example is you can access internet nowadays on the phone using Bluetooth, right? So you have the phone, you create a network between your PC, your computer, and your phone through Bluetooth, and this is called, and then you can access the internet through the data connection of your phone, right? So that is one way of accessing internet. Another way of accessing internet is just like Wi-Fi, right? But you can see that the TCP/IP stack that you need to access internet is common between, no matter how you access the internet, through Wi-Fi, through GSM, through Bluetooth, and this and that, it's all the same. In fact, you can even access internet through IR. So the way it is done is the TCP/IP component is common, so it is separated out, and you can then plug in any network interface to that TCP/IP. Right? And we will see this detail, how this is done. But the idea is, you access the internet whenever you switch from one network interface to another network interface, you just change the module. Right? And that saves a lot of space. You can imagine the TCP/IP stack is a lot. If you look at the code, the size of the TCP/IP, it's a complex code. But if you want to run it in, let's say, 200 kilobytes only, you just load it once and you share it. So executing kernel needs to add layers. So whenever there is more thing, if you just keep adding the layer, use those functionalities. When you switch off your IR, infrared port, it will unload all of these modules immediately. And that is how your phone is saving all the memory. So I was discussing always with this, the initial performance is it, you have to load everything. So that's the performance hit. But that is fine on the phone. You are okay with waiting a little bit time for the network to get connected. We are all used to that. But after it is connected, it's very fast. So Unix is one operating system that typically boots an active kernel that goes CMP, and now it is far more. So Unix, Linux, all of these operating systems, they just take a lot of time to boot. If you restart any server in our administration room, it will take almost even 5 minutes because it loads everything. And that is a big difference between Symbian-like operating system and a desktop-like. The reason this is done here is because it's a server. So whenever you even start an HTTP server and so on, you don't want the initial penalty. Everything should start immediately. So if you go to Google website, it should not take for your first web page to load 10 minutes or 5 minutes, right? You want an immediate response from google.com or gmail.com. So that's why on the server, they will load everything at the boot time. So that afterwards there is no delay. Right? You don't care how much time Google takes to boot their server. Even if it takes 1 hour, you are fine with it. But you want your emails to come very fast. Okay? So that is one big difference between Symbian and Linux-like operating system. Next thing is multi-threading. So what is the big difference between multiprocessor and multi-threading? Why do we need these two separate things? If we have multi-processing capability, why do you think there is another thing called multi-threading?
Multi-thread shares data and code.
And memory also. So you don't want a context switch every time you change.
Right. So with multiprocessor, what happens is, as you were saying, when you switch from one process to another process, there is context switching. And context switching means you have to reload all the register values, heap and memory and code and everything. So it takes a big hit. As opposed to multi-threading, where when you switch from one thread to another thread, you don't reload your global memory or even your code. That is all same. So any example where you would use multi-threading? What are the standard examples?
Server client.
Multiple clients.
Multiple clients put on the server, so HTTP server, another on your machine, on all the machines, laptops you are using.
Tabs which use Explorer.
Tabs,
Explorer.
right? So all the Internet Explorer tabs, Chrome, Firefox, so all the tabs that you will see, it's all multi-threaded. Right? You just create one more thread because you share the basic browser code which is constant. So this is why we started with thread, and this is why on the phone also we have thread, multi-thread. So each thread can execute a request from the kernel service. So kernel, whenever you get a system call, the kernel will put one thread to service your request, and now when the another service or another system call comes in, it will put another thread. So that's how it becomes very responsive. The kernel is responsive. As opposed to the other case where you just have one thread in the kernel. What will happen is when you service one request, one system call, that thread is busy and it cannot service any other kernel request. So that is a disadvantage. So that's why we have multiple threading even in the kernel. Even though it adds complexity, we put multi-threading inside the kernel. So these are examples. So a user mode application that requests the kernel mode operation of loading a set of data from the flash. Right? So you insert the flash card into the phone and you have to load all of that data, let's say all the files, music files and so on, onto the memory. It takes time. Right? Because all the I/O operations are always slow. So if you have just one thread, that thread will be busy in loading all of these things and your phone is unresponsive. So that's why they put multiple threading, so that one thread you can devote or designate only to do the copying, and the rest of the threads can again service the other kernel request. So, for example, another phone call comes in. When this is happening, you have to service the phone call. If you have another thread, you can do that. This is fine. So let's look at the passive kernel components. So anybody can tell me examples, what could be the passive component inside the kernel? So we talked about the active, which is continuously executing. What could be passive component? It is not typically active, so sometimes it gets executed. Interrupt handling. Yes, interrupt handling is in fact passive because what happens is only when the interrupt comes in, you will execute the interrupt service routine and then finish it. So that is one example. So here is the example. So whenever there is a system call is a software interrupt and this is a hardware interrupt. Both of them are serviced exactly the same way. So these are executed only when there is a need. All the components which are executed only when there is a need and not continuously, it's all passive components. So for example, the libraries that we load, stdio and so on, right, or the driver, only when there is a need, you will execute that code. So that part is becoming that part we can categorize as passive components. So all the device driver, and we see there are two types of device driver: physical device driver and logical device driver. So all these components are executed only when there is a need, and these are all passive. So we talk a lot about system calls. So what happens with the system call is it's a layer of abstraction between user and the kernel, right? And system call is a software interrupt. We talked about, so can you tell me, I think I gave an example last time where there is something called a software interrupt. Can anybody tell me an example of a software interrupt that you typically use? It's a system call, yeah, it is also, but something that you very often use. Killing the process, like you do Control C. Right? When you want to terminate a process, you do Control C. So that actually is doing a system call, and that sends a signal. Interrupts. There is some interrupt service routine that gets executed from the operating system, and that goes and kills your process. So that is an example of a software interrupt or a system call. And similarly, there are more of these. So all of these are handled exactly the same way as hardware interrupts. So there is, so I think let's just discuss it for those who missed that class. So there is a table called interrupt service vector. Interrupt. And so there is an interrupt number and there is an address. Okay. So in this table, you mention all these numbers of interrupts starting with 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever numbers. And then for every number, there is an address inside your memory. And what is stored in this address? ISR. So it is an interrupt service routine. Right? So whenever you raise an interrupt, so in the hardware it could be changing the voltage on a pin. So on the processor there are some pins on your processor. If you change the voltage from let's say 0 to 5, you increase it. So it's a threshold. It crosses 5 volts. That means that pin will have a particular number here, and then that you will execute that service routine. In the software also, you can say which interrupt you want to execute, and you have to tell the number. When you say the number, that particular address will be fetched, and then the service routine will be executed. So all of this thing happens through the system calls. And whenever you change from user to system call, it's a privileged merged operation, right? So that means what happens is, when you do a software interrupt, before you execute this kernel, you first change a bit inside your processor that tells now it is going into privilege mode. You execute this service routine, and then at the end you again change it back, right? And so that because at this end you are transferring the control to the user mode, and you don't want user to get privileges, super user privileges. So just outside this, or just when you finish this, you change it back. So all of this will go into privilege mode, and when the user executes again, it's non-privileged mode. So what is security-wise? So what is the guarantee that user is never executing this privilege mode operation? What do you think is the solution? So is the question clear? So the question is, there is something inside the kernel that is privilege, right? You want privilege mode operation. You have to set a bit, but the user should not be able to set that bit. What happens if the user sets this bit and executes his own code?
Then it will interrupt the high priority process. Maybe if user gets a chance to.
Things to affect the normal functioning of the system and
Right.
crash.
System will crash. So you don't want this. So the question is, how do kernel make sure that it is executing user mode code?
APIs.
about this maybe for a minute. What we want is users should never be able to execute a privileged operation. And so if he sets this bit and executes it, it's a privilege, right? So how do we make sure that in the operating system, user can't do it?
So we define that these are the permissions that these tasks can be done by the user and these cannot.
Right. So how do you use those permissions now?
Only user, if a user is requesting to set that particular bit to a different value, so that OS can come to know as in he is attempting to do changes in that mode, so he should not be allowed.
Right. So if you combine the solution, so the permission is the right thing. First thing, so whenever you in the Linux you do sudo, right? You execute some instruction with something called sudo, right? And then what happens if I don't? So there is something called a sudo privilege which somebody has, and some people don't have sudo privilege. So if a user without the sudo privilege executes something, what happens?
It's logged and
It's logged and it says that your email will be sent to the administrator. But what happens is, when you execute this, it checks with the permissions, right? So you have a user ID. So every user has its own ID, right? And then there is a group ID and so on. We don't need to go into those details. But every user has its own ID. And when you execute a command, operating system code, which is loaded in the memory, checks whether this user has this permission or not. Okay. Now another question is, if I change that code, now let's say I'm a hacker and I want to just break the system, right? If I want to change, there is some code in the operating system that is checking the permissions. Right? If I change that code, which checks the permission and even let me allow or let me execute the sudo, then I have defeated the system. So what is the solution to avoid that? So the question now is a little different. So we understood that there is a sudo privilege, some users have, some users don't have, right? And then whoever has the sudo will execute the privileged operation. But so there is a code in the operating, it's all code, there is nothing other than the code. There is some code in the operating system that is checking whether some user has this privilege or not. If I maliciously corrupt this code and make it to run for any user execute this, I have defeated the system and the system is compromised. So how do I make sure that this thing does not happen? What would be a solution?
So that can be read-only code.
So we are very close to that. So it's that code is something, so he's talking about read-only. It's exactly not read-only, but there is something different, right? So when the operating system boots, there is something called a bootloader and so on, right? So I will not go into those details of everything that happens at the boot time. But there is some code which is executed and put inside the initial part of the RAM, right? So it's loading the operating system code, it's reading from the hard disk and it's loading into the RAM and nobody is allowed to change that code. Right? If anybody changes this code other than the boot time, so at the boot time you can make it read write. Right? After your system is booted, operating system is loaded, you will put some flag where it's now read only, as you say. Nobody can change it. So operating system is saved inside the RAM. Now if I change it on the hard disk, what happens? Right? I change it in the hard disk and that can corrupt it.
Yes, it's in the first 512 KB of the hard disk itself. There's a
Right.
very special segment for it.
Segment for it. Right. So again in the hard disk you can, so whatever thing I did for the RAM, you can do the same thing in the hard disk. When the operating system is installed, you can write something within the first master boot record and all these important sectors where it is protected. And then rest of things are unprotected. So you make sure that even that part is not changed. But of course, I mean, if you are a hacker and if you really want to change it, you can change it. But that means you have the whole control of the operating system. And if you get the control of the operating system, you can change anything. But once the operating system is loaded, you can't do all of these things. So that is how the operating system is secure. This is how the security of system call is provided. Right? So there are multiple levels of security. You don't want anybody, first of all, to execute something inside the kernel as his own code. Because kernel is privileged, it can do anything. and if the user code gets to execute inside the kernel, it could be malicious. So first of all, you have to not allow this. So there is a bit of the processor that sets the super user. Right? Inside the RAM, which takes the permission, who can execute this and who cannot execute this, that code is protected. And once that code is protected, that means when the operating system is loaded, nothing bad will happen. So you can actually prove it. There are people who prove that, just like in the mathematical proof, you prove something at the end, you say, okay, this is not possible or this is possible. There are people who work in this area and prove it, whether anybody can attack the operating system or not. And it's a very active area of research. Right, so I was talking about the permissions. So it says platform security has implemented that any request to the kernel going inside the kernel must be accompanied by the capability to make that request. Right? So you take the permissions, and if you have the permissions, then only execute it. So even in the Java any code that you write, there are lots of permissions, and we talked about that. There are some permissions, for example, sending SMS and receiving SMS. This is also a permission, and the phone will ask you. Right? But some applications already have this permission, and they can send SMS without you asking it. So this is how it is done. So if you look at the whole operating system now, if I show you a picture of the Symbian operating system, this is what it looks like. At the bottom it's hardware, right? So this is the hardware part, and then on top of that it's all software. So you see, and this is privilege mode from here to here. Hardware is of course privileged, and then there is part of the kernel which is privileged, and then this is user mode. So all the servers or user thread and so on, they happen in the user mode. Okay? So we'll see what personality RTOS is, but this we already talked about LDD and PDD. So these are device drivers. Right? So these are running just on top of the hardware. So anybody knows what could be logical driver and what could be a physical driver? You must have seen this when you install Windows. It says loading logical abstraction. Or in Linux also, if you install Ubuntu, they show this message. So there is something called hardware abstraction layer, HAL. So it's loading HAL. So any guesses what it would be? And the same thing applies here in this operating system. It's something which is called logical driver and something called physical driver. Think about, so you can think about this and tell me.
So the like driver can be layered, the LDD part which deals with the logical, PDD is like dealing with physical parameters.
So let me also write this. I talked about hardware abstraction layer. What? This is another word for the same thing. LDD, PDD. Hardware abstraction layer. So you install Ubuntu on so many machines, right? Everybody here has a different laptop. HP, Compaq, Samsung, so on. Right? Everybody has a different screen, everybody has a different speaker, so on. So how are the device drivers designed then?
So device drivers are, some drivers are low-level drivers and some are abstraction level. So what happens is that for all the like printers and all the printers that are manufactured, Windows is one driver. So all the drivers that are built by the manufacturers must respond to that driver's request. So whatever functions like they put in empty functions in that part must be implemented by the device driver.
Right. So for example, the network printer. If I have it, so there are some printers which you can access over the network and give a print command, right? So the part where it is you send a print command over network is constant, no matter whether you have an HP printer or a Compaq printer or some other printer. It's the same, right? So that part Windows will implement typically, right? And they will call it a logical device driver, LDD, for the printer. But what happens underneath is, depending upon HP or Compaq and so on, you need to change some things at the bottom in the physical driver. Right? So that is the physical driver. And that's what happens even in Ubuntu. When you load the Ubuntu CD at the boot time and you want to install it, or there is a mode where you can just run the Ubuntu on your machine from the CD itself. I don't know whether you have tried this. Just put the CD and it loads, everything is in the RAM. You can run Linux. When you switch off computer, take out the CD, the Linux is gone, right? Because it was already in the RAM. So the way it is done is, it is using hardware abstraction layer. So it will look out for what kind of devices you have, speaker, Ethernet, Wi-Fi, and then it will take the corresponding driver from here, and then on top of that it will just put the logical device driver. That's it. It all combines and then it can execute for any device. And this is what is done in Symbian also, because Symbian phones, there are so many phones. There is Nokia, Samsung, Sony Ericsson, and Micromax, Probably, and so on. So you don't want to have a whole device driver for each of the phone. So Symbian OS will give you LDD, and then the manufacturer will provide you with PDD. You combine these two things and you can have the operating system. So let's look at the details of this diagram. So there is something called Application Specific Standard Product, ASSP. It implements a number of components through standard interface. So a specific device driver is not loaded. So you don't need to go into detail because some things are not very in detail. Another thing is RTOS, which is the real-time component. So the whole operating system is not real-time, only some part of it. And whatever is the real-time component, for example, making phone calls and so on, those are run separately. So you can guarantee in how much time you will execute that operation. So RTOS will implement, for example, GSM functionality, the actual making phone calls and receiving phone calls. So that is all done using real-time operating system. And you can have many paths from top to bottom to the hardware. A user, for example, is user mode application might go through the file server, so one of the servers, and then the server will make a system call or a kernel request, and then you reach the kernel. So that is one way. Or a phone call might initiate a function in the RTOS. So if there is some application who wants to make a phone call, it will not go through the server. It will directly go to the RTOS, which is the kernel, inside the kernel, and then make the phone call. So there are multiple ways you can go from top to bottom. And extension, there's something which was called extension at the right side. I don't know whether you remember. This is extension here, which is sitting inside the kernel, but on the other side. So extension are device drivers that are loaded and executed when a phone boots up and do not directly interact with the user mode application. So there are some device drivers which don't exactly interact with the user mode, and they get just boot when you start the phone, they just get inside into the memory. So to summarize this part, what we have looked at is how the kernels are structured typically, and in Symbian OS in particular, how was the structure of the kernel. The nano kernel, there is something around the nano kernel, then there are servers, and then there is user mode operation. And we looked at the kernel components from active and passive perspective. That means there are some components, or which components are continuously running, and those are all acting. And there are some components which are into the action only when needed. For example, the loading of device driver, interrupt handlings, and so on. So these are all passive components. And then we saw the whole structure, the layered approach to the operating system, starting from the hardware all the way to the user mode through multiple layers. Right? And we saw what is the device driver. So what we'll do now is we'll go in detail about probably each of these components. So let's take a break of 5 minutes and then we can assemble.
Shortest job first.
Shortest job first. So these are typically used. Right? So let's say I am using round robin, which is also called time slice based. So in my example that I will give you now is, let's take an example of computer. You all know computer, operating system. So there are multiple things that are happening. Let's say one process wants to write to the flash disk, right? From the hard disk to the flash disk. So there is one process who is writing from hard disk drive to USB flash. Right? There is another process which is just doing complex mathematical operation. Let's say it is doing exponential operation. Right? So these are, let's say, just two processes running continuously, and I'm using this round robin. So what will happen is my time slice is such that this process, I mean, let's say it's process A, process B. The process A executes, it takes some memory, some data from the memory, from the hard disk, read it, and then goes to the USB and write it. So what will be the sequence of operations? Can you tell me for this process? So we are looking at the bottom up. It's not high level abstraction, but it's a really, in the process, what's happening? So there will be a system call. So in this process A, there will be a system call made to read some sector on the hard disk. Yes, you have to mention exactly the sector number and so on, cylinder, everything. Read that data, right? That will take time because hard disk is slow as compared to the RAM, right? So the operating system will put a request to the hard disk controller that I want this data. Okay, when that data comes, it will come to the process, it will put it in the memory, and then from the memory it will again go to the USB, and again it will do the same thing. It's not now sectors and cylinders, but some other way, like the flash address. It will tell and okay, write it. And this, by the way, is doing exponential. So this is continuously running. It's doing mathematical computation of exponential operation. Okay? So what's happening is, operating system is switching between A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B using this algorithm. But a lot of times, A is just waiting, right? Because it sends a request to the hard disk. Hard disk will take its own time. So A is waiting there. It goes to, operating system will go to B when the time slice is over. So this is, if you look at the time, it's exactly the same value, right? So it's A, B, A, B, A. Now A executes something and most of the time it is idle now. Then B executes totally. Then even it could happen that A is still idle. A gets loaded in the memory from the context switch and it starts getting the data, it's waiting for the data, hard disk control says like, hey, I need more time. Right? So A will execute here, but the processor is not doing anything. And then again it will go to B and probably A will get data here. So you send a request here and you get data probably here. So that means this is idle. Right? So you see in the total time, the A could be idle a lot of time and the same cycle could repeat. One time for the hard disk, one time for the USB. And B, by the way, is totally executing. Right? So B is fine. So this is, if you see, this is a problem for the operating system. If you use round robin, this could be a problem. So what could be a solution? Can you think of a solution now? What could operating system do otherwise? Avoid this idle period in between.
When the request has been sent, we can shift the processor to a next processor until an interrupt comes and...
Right.
Because request no waiting stage पे चला जाता है.
Yes.
It keeps on waiting until an
Right. Right. So one thing is, A is coming here back and it is waiting. Right? And then goes back and maybe probably again it will come and it waits. So all that wait is not good. But operating system is not aware of this because there is a communication between process A and the hard disk controller. That is happening. OS is outside this communication loop. It doesn't know that A is doing this. It will just take A, put it in the memory, ask him to run, A will say internally that I don't have any data, it will go back, right? So that is not a good thing. This is something we can improve in, let's say, in Symbian OS. Right? In phone, we don't want this thing to happen because we don't have a fast processor where we can just do idle, right? Another thing is, there is something which is about context switching. So when you switch from A to B or B to A, operating system has to do a lot of things. And you all know what context switching means. And that also takes time, right? So Symbian operating system decided to avoid these two bottlenecks. One thing is idle part, and second thing is this context switching, right? So what operating system decided is to have something called an active object. So an active object is a new concept in the operating system, and Symbian OS came up with this for the first time. What they say to first of all avoid this problem is operating system is now smarter, it is doing something more. When A goes for a request here, A registers this request with the operating system. Right? So operating system is now kept in the loop of communication. That I am sending a request and this is my request and I want a response back. Right? So operating system keeps a node. So if you look at the process control blocks, PCBs in the operating system, there is one more field where it mentions what a process is waiting for. So this is the PCB, and by the way, the same PCB and process concept is called active objects. Right? So inside PCB, there is another field which is a request field. So operating system now knows for every process what it is waiting for. Right? So operating system will not schedule A here. Because operating system knows that its service or its request is not yet fully satisfied, so it will not even keep A here. If there is C there, it will put C, or it will just keep B there. Right? So next time when there is a need for time switching or context switching, and it will check whether the request of A is satisfied or not. If it is satisfied, then only it will schedule A. And that's how the whole process control block has become active now, because it mentions what is the request it is waiting for. An operating system can do smart scheduling. So this is a new thing in operating system for Symbian OS, where operating system makes note of for every process what it is waiting for, and only when that request is available, then only it will schedule the process. Is this concept clear? This is a new concept. Another problem or bottleneck we talked about is context switching, right? So it takes a lot of time to do a context switching. What another thing Symbian OS does is, instead of loading the new thread or new process to exactly last time where it left off, it always starts it from a defined entry point. So you know in J2ME there is something called a start, right? Start and pause and resume and everything. So every time your application starts, it always goes to the start. Doesn't matter whether it was resumed or starting for the first time. Same thing happens here. Whenever there is a context switch, you always go back to the first instruction. So operating system doesn't have to remember where it had left for the last time. So when A was left in the code to some instruction pointer, it will not remember it. Next time it will load A again, it will put the instruction pointer again at a defined entry point. And user gets to define what that entry point is. So in the start tab, he can write whatever he wants to write. But operating system will always load A into that point. So now operating system has to remember less this way, and then it becomes, the context will become a little faster. So there are two big differences. One difference is operating system keeps note of for every process what it is waiting for, and only when that request is satisfied, it will load that process. And second thing is, it will not remember where it has left off. It will just have a defined entry point, and then whenever that process is loaded, it will load into that point. That's it. So this is what an active object concept is, and this is what you are already doing in Java at least one point.
So, but it will increase the complexity at the user point of view.
Yes, yes. So user has to do little more, right? So there is again a trade-off between. But what happens is the kind of programs that you will write for the phone are not that where you will need this functionality, where you have left out, you come up, okay. Even if you are loaded at the same time, that's fine. Right? So this is what the idea was, and they saved a lot inside the operating system because of that. So I accepted that. So this is agreed that user has to now think a little more, but that's okay. We have a smarter brain than the processor. So we can do a little more in terms of writing the code, but the operating system becomes very easy now. And then it becomes faster also because of all of this. Right? But by the way, this is something that operating system is doing additional, which otherwise the standard operating system don't do. So there is something more that needs to be done and something less for the operating system. And that combined thing is called an active object. So this part, the PCB and everything, it becomes an active object now. Everything within the operating system for Symbian OS is implemented using an active object. Okay, so if you hear this term now here onwards, what active object is, so it is like this. The scheduling is little different, the information is little different. So let's stop here. So I will talk about these in detail, scheduling and so on. Okay.